Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be going over the impact of Obsidian Flames. This video is mostly going to be talking about how current archetypes are going to be adapting thanks to the new inclusions from the Obsidian Flames expansion, in terms of what cards we can be adding in to improve the deck lists themselves or to adapt to the new archetypes coming out in Obsidian Flames. So let's first establish the best decks in the format pre-Obsidian Flames. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen, this is based on the two tournaments we've had in the Paldea Evolve format, the World Championships and the NAIC. And on the right-hand side of the screen, this is the best top 8 frequency in online tournaments throughout the month of July and a little bit of August as well. And it's actually quite similar, even though there are some different placements of the top 10 decks. I think there's only one difference in decks, and that is that 10th place where MIRAIDON has done a little bit better in person tournaments, and then the pure PALKIA has done a little bit better in online tournaments. But these are the 11 decks we're going to be talking about today, looking at the top 10s from both of these and combining that. So these are the sort of top contenders. Even with new things being introduced to the format, I don't expect it to be changing too much, because all of these have proven themselves to be consistent, powerful, and have a reasonable spread of matchups into the other top 10 decks in the game. So we'll first talk about what really comes out of the new set, and it feels like the real main flagship archetype is Charizard EX, and so far we've seen this go alongside ARCEUS and Pidgeot. There could also be some builds using Forest Seal Stone and Bibarel, but the main thing to take away here from Charizard is that it's a very, very chunky two-prizer that is a dark type and has grass weakness. So these are all things to bear in mind. Grass Pokemon become a little bit more valuable because they should have an easier time of knocking out this otherwise very tanky Pokemon. We know dark typing is historically pretty good in the last few months because of Mew VMAX and Gardevoir EX, so that's somewhat of a challenge for those two decks to sort of overcome now. And Fire Energy in general gets a little bit better because this is great acceleration for some fire style attackers. And it's going to be a rare candy-based deck that is also very ability-reliant, which also means there's going to be more emphasis on Path to the Peak, possibly going into this format than ever before, really, because it's just yet another archetype that is very reliant on those abilities to even get into the game in the first place. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a couple other cards that might get a look into this format. I think Sizzle is one of the most efficient Stage 1 attacking Pokemon that we've seen in a little while. Even though this is the same as Flapple's damage output, it cannot be understated how weak Flapple was just because it had a 40 hit point Applin and an 80 hit point Stage 1. Now we have a much higher hit point Scizor and Scyther, which means they're actually usable cards, and I think possibly going alongside Lost Box, which I'll talk about later. And Glimmora EX, there could be a couple ways to try and play this card. The Dust Field is really frustrating for setup-based decks that really want to look to go wide, and this could help enable Rapid Strike Urshifu for being a backup attacker in a deck like this, where Glimmora is kind of that early game Pokemon that you look towards whilst you build behind it, and trying to stunt the development of other archetypes as you go. But there could also be a quad Glimmora deck that also plays Path to the Peak and the Lunar Rock combo, which I might be touching on a few times today actually, where you turn off Path's effect on your own Pokemon whilst affecting the opponent. So you get all your abilities on your side, your opponent doesn't get any, and also they have a low bench size with that Dust Field. So it could be quite a disruptive, annoying deck that takes advantage of Solrock Lunatone, which actually is becoming a bit more of an interesting combination than I first thought when I started looking at those cards and how limiting it was to only play with, 3 bench Pokemon because you're committing to Lunatone and Solrock. I think Path is just so good in the format right now that we could be seeing a number of decks trying to fulfill that role. Let's start with Gardevoir then, and I'm actually going to spring the trap of Lunar Rock already, where I think this deck could end up becoming a Path-based archetype, and that sounds insane to think about, because Gardevoir has really struggled with Path to the Peak. It's one of the biggest issues the deck can face, is that at any point in the game you can be hit with Iono Path or Judge Path, and if you just don't have the bounces, you're not using Gardevoir EX, you're not ramping into damage output. Well now, if you really think about it, Lunatone Solrock becomes your stadium bounce. It becomes your answer to Path in opposing players' decks, which means that, they can't really hand disrupt you out of this. They're just going to sit on the board for you and suddenly you're no longer worried about Path to the Peak from the opponent. Maybe they'll start gusting Lunatones and Soul Rocks rather than your other Pokemon, but if ever the opponent's going for that, they're not knocking out a Pokemon that has a huge amount of energy already fully loaded onto it, more than likely. So this actually seems like a really great way that Gardevoir could safeguard itself from Path to the Peak on its own end, whilst then introducing Path to your list itself, so that you're becoming the disruptive force and making it more difficult for Lugia players, Mew players, the mirror match, and most importantly, Charizard. I feel like this archetype is probably not going to be as speedy as builds that we have seen that utilize, you know, just other draw-style Pokemon like Mew, like Greninja, these sorts of Pokemon. You may not have space on your board to physically play them, because you're having to commit to Lunatone and Solrock being on the board, and then essentially the rest of your board should just be your Gardevoir pieces, more than likely. But being able to play Paths really changes the emphasis of the archetype and makes it much more defensive. We already know Iono is a great card in Gardevoir. Now having Iono Path in your own deck list could actually make this new sort of age of Gardevoir a really interesting approach. It's something that I haven't really tested with just yet, but I am going to put time into, because I do think it's a really interesting concept in theory. Now, that one is really harebrained scheme and may not even work out. I think the more likely situations is that we could be seeing a splash of one stadium here or there from the new set. The Town Store could be interesting. We know, of course, Forest Hill Stone makes it into a number of Gardevoir players' deck lists, and we have seen a Choice Belt in Guardy actually win a regional championships. So having a Town Store just as a one-off stadium and then having two different one-off tools in your deck could lead to some more interesting plays, just because having tutor for that Forest Hill Stone is actually such a big deal. And if you are choosing to play that Choice Belt to just hit through with your Gardevoir EX in the opening stages, it can be a nice sort of lower maintenance option than having to find, 5-6 energy into the bin early, so you're actually using, Shining Arcana or Zacian in the opening stages to actually take prize cards. It makes the Gardevoir EX much more of a dangerous threat. And then the Pokemon League headquarters is definitely a tech card that can help out against Lost Zone, right? We know that Gardevoir is one of the better Iono users in the game, and having a HQ plus Iono play might make it a little bit more difficult for a Sableye to get into the mix on the following turn if you're taking a prize turn by turn as you go. It would probably force them to find either Stadium Bounce or Mirage Gate to actually weave in a Sableye, and when it's on a low hand size for the opponent, it's not quite as easy. So I think there could be very subtle tweaks to Gardevoir in this set if you are just going to be looking to add in a couple of the new stadiums. I do think that, we even saw at the World Championships, Tord was already playing Lost Vacuum, but I think that is a far more important card in this set now that we see Vengeful Punch, which could be going into all sorts of different decks just because of how universal that tool is compared to something like the Box of Disaster. I think the Vengeful is just much more easy to splash into decks, which means Vacuum is going to be a high priority for Guardy coming into the next set. It may even become a 2-count in Guardy, to be honest. But let me know your thoughts on a path-based build of Guardy with Luna Rock. It's actually going to be something I bring out in the next couple of days because I can't get this concept out of my mind. And I think it is actually really interesting to think of Luna Rock as being your universal path bounce in your own deck list, and then you can be the one abusing Path against other people. I think it's really, really interesting for Guardy, and a sort of design space we haven't really looked at for an archetype like this. Onto Lost Zone, I also think the Town Store could be a great stadium for this archetype. I know Pokestop does give you that extra reach, especially towards some of your ball search cards in the opening stages, and can be great at grabbing like Lost Vacuum, for example, but a Town Store is just much more reliable. You insta-search out your Forest Hill Stone, and that's such a crucial card for you, not only finding your initial Colrus, but also just grabbing a target that could then be vacuumed on the same turn could really allow you to get to 7 a little bit more fluidly, I think. So Town Store could end up being also a space saver, because we have seen as high as like 2 or 3 Forest Hill Stone going into Turbo Lost Box. Now 2 is that like maximum count. You can play like 2 Town Stores and be pretty happy with that, giving yourself many more outs to actually just get rolling into the game, which I think is really important. It could also give you the incentive to then add in other tool cards as well, like 1 copy of Bravery Charm or 1 copy of Choice Belt. I know that could be really helpful for Dragonite. It then allows you to hit 280. So yeah, I think the Town Store does open some interesting avenues for Lost Box, because it wouldn't be too bad to just add in 1 or 2 additional tools to improve your basic Pokemon's damage output or improve their tankability, so you can maximize the value of your multi-prize Pokemon, which could be really cool. The other avenue that I really want to explore is a pure single prize variant of Lost Box, which is just relying on Sableye, Cram, and then having some of these stage ones, most notably Sizzle. I think Sizzle is super efficient and very powerful. We have Luminous Energy already. You can easily play Clara and just have a thin count of Metal Energy alongside your like Psych Energy for Sableye and whatnot. So I do think there's definitely a chance for Sizzle to do well in this format. We know that Charizard has a ton of abilities in play, Gardevoir does, Chien-Pao does, and is weak to metal, of course. Arc decks play a ton of abilities all over the shop, so yeah, Sizzle has the potential to be very, very powerful. I'm definitely a believer of this card, and it's just trying to find the right home for it right now, which is my biggest challenge, because we just don't really have good enough search for Sizzle itself outside of just playing Ultra Balls, which doesn't really fit into Lost Zone anyway. But I do think the card just has really good damage output, and it's not something I want to sleep on, so yeah, I'm definitely going to put some time into a purely single prize Lost Box that has Sizzle in there for just some frequent high damage outputs throughout the game. Fusion Mew is an interesting one. This obviously won the World Championship, so it's back on the radar for many players. And we do actually gain a couple nice things. I do think Vengeful Punch is, again, sort of more universal than the Box of Disaster. Obviously, you're dealing less damage, but it means that if your opponent is doing any prep damage and you're not able to Psychic Leap, this will still proc, which I think is excellent for you. So I do think it's a slight upgrade to the Box of Disaster, which was in the World's winning deck list. But Town Store also seems to be a decent card. Again, we've seen like 3 counts of Forest Hill Stone in all sorts of fusion-based builds of Mew, but now going down to 2 Forest and just adding in 1 Town Store gives you naturally an additional Path Bounce, which is never a bad thing. But also can just tutor the Forest Hill Stone for you. And as we know, we have seen the likes of Cleansing Gloves in the list, Choice Bet in the list, Vengeful Punch, sometimes all in 1 counts, which means Town Store just naturally enters the deck list and becomes a really nice 1-card buff, essentially, which is never a bad thing. Fusion Mew is oftentimes about those fine margins, and whenever you can give yourself small percentages to just getting into the game or finding your Power Spike turn, it's going to be really beneficial to you, which I think is very good. Now, the headache for Fusion Mew is that Charizard does seem to be a difficult matchup. It can quite easily maintain an all single prize board state in the opening stages, doesn't always need to put the Arceus down in the opening setup, so possibly they don't really give up many prizes until they're ready to Zard, and then they just have a 2-attack win condition. So it seems like it's going to be a bit of a challenge for the Mew players, so something to bear in mind certainly. I think the main couple ways Mew could try and adapt would be possibly going back towards a Judge Path-based build. Now, I do think it's risky because, of course, Spiritomb can still be rooting around many archetypes, but if Charizard becomes a big enough deck in the format, enough presence, it means that people can't commit a deck space to a Spiritomb anymore, which means possibly a DTE-based build of Mew like sneaks back into the meta at different points in this format, because people just refuse to play Spiritomb at this point because there'll be bigger fish to fry, essentially, and Mew possibly pushes down the tier list just because of Charizard's existence. So I do think that's something to bear in mind. Judge Path is quite strong against Charizard players, so it could give you actually a reasonable chance into the matchup, even though you may not be favoured. I think at the very least Echoing Horn becomes more of a must, just so that you are able to rinse and repeat some easier prizes against Charizard. It's really hard for you to get through the Zards themselves, so just going for the Arc Vs before they V-Star, and then maybe even just power tableting into a Pidgeot or something at one point in the game could be your prize map. So Echoing Horn giving you a slightly easier route to those 6 prize cards in a straight-up race could also be quite important. Onto Lugia, really doesn't gain much from the set, but the one thing I will say is that Duraludon seems to be going out of Arc decks simply because there are just more basic energy decks in the format. There's your Charizard now, there's Gardy, there's Chien-Pao. There's just so many reasons why Dura just is less and less powerful, and even just that 220 baseline is getting worse when there are now 330 hit point 2 prizes to deal with. So you're basically just outclassed, and I think that's a good thing for Lugia because it can more freely roam without the need for Urshifu VMAX in the deck list, possibly, or could even allow you to play a colourless build of Lugia. So anytime we can gain some consistency spaces, which the colourless build naturally does because it doesn't have to fit in the urns, or just a single strike build that doesn't have to play the Urshi anymore, is actually a small bonus for Lugia. So that's at least something going in your favour. And I think this archetype is going to continue to be around. There's not much reason for it to not see play still. Onto Umbreon, and I have chosen my words carefully here because, like I said, with the Lugia section, Dura just doesn't seem to offer anywhere near as much utility as it did in the previous format. And especially with this headache of Charizard, Arc needs to probably add in some grass Pokemon. And I think Leafeon V-Star fits the bill best, simply because first of all, Leafeon V is really good for Arc decks, right? We have often said that the deck is all about getting your Arc plus energy drop, and a Leafeon V gives you that bailout option that if you don't get your energy drop on your opening hand and just have ball search cards, you can search out a Leafeon and then you can use its ability to end your turn on an energy drop. It also means that if you get multiple Arc down, you can get an additional energy drop on a benched one as well, so it means you're less reliant on like hitting Raihan on turn 2 or whatever. So I do think Leafeon is really powerful for that approach. It naturally has some reduction of damage, and it hits enough to one-hit KO Zards cleanly, thanks to weakness. So I do think this could be a really nice 1-1 or 2-2 line in an Arc Umbreon and replace that Dura. I really do think that Leafeon seems to be the best choice here overall. Have seen some like Serperiors and whatnot, but I really think Leafeon, just for the regular V of Leafeon, is going to be the best option for Arc players in general, which I think is really good. I also think Vengeful Punch, again, pretty solid card, helps out against Gardevoir. You know, we'd seen Panic Mask in Arc Umbreons before, but I think the big upside is it helps out against the likes of Chien-Pao and Miraidon, where Arc is so often capped at that 180 thanks to double turbo energy. Being able to attach a Vengeful Punch means that if a Chien-Pao is up trading into you, or if a Miraidon is trading into you, you get that knockout immediately, which I think is really handy, but also is just a tech card for Gardevoir. So just the universal nature of Vengeful Punch seems to be pretty solid in my opinion. It also just in general, even if you're not getting knockouts on some of these specific Pokemon, it makes Radiant Alakazam an even better card in the deck to allow you to carve out some easier prizes throughout the game. So yeah, this seems to be a really nice tool card. I've inserted it into my Arc Evolutions deck, which is what I'm calling it now. So it seems to be a really nice fit. Onto CHIEN-PAO BAXCALIBUR, a couple of interesting possible inclusions, and I know recently in an online event a Pidgeot EX build of Chien-Pao had done pretty well, but I'm actually a bit of a non-believer of Pidgeot in this deck, to be honest with you, because I think Bibarel is just a little bit better. Just because we naturally play Ultra Ball and Superior, we can reduce our hand size so often and just draw a lot of cards from Bib, and the fact that Bib isn't punished by Path, and Chien-Pao is already a really Path vulnerable deck. I think Bibarel is still slightly better. I think that also the Letter of Encouragement is pretty reasonable, but you are also going to be pulling out energies from Chien-Pao regardless. I think the thing that I enjoy more about CHIEN-PAO BAXCALIBUR in this format is that it has a pretty good Charizard matchup. I think as long as you're getting into play, you're oftentimes racing them quite efficiently. You have ways of using Greninja very effectively, especially if you are playing the Lost Cities or the Cancelling clone. You'll find an avenue to take a multi-prize knockout via a one-prize Pokemon, which can be really nice. And you know, the fact that Charizard is bulky isn't that much of a problem for Chien-Pao. You have that reach potential to continue to trade. And typically, because we're using a basic attacker in most situations here, we're going to have, you know, a faster out-the-gate approach. Even if we are going with Palkia in the opening stages, Charizard and Arc will both be well out of range of hitting your V-Star in one-hit KO, which means oftentimes Palkia can at least take like 3 prizes on its own. So yeah, I feel like you're going to have a pretty decent time into the Charizard matchup. So CHIEN-PAO BAXCALIBUR looking like it's a much more well-positioned archetype going into this format, even if you don't actually add any of the new cards from the set. Similar thing can really be said for Losso and Giratina. Doesn't really gain anything new into the deck list, but I think the list that we have seen, you know, it's got top 4 worlds, and it wasn't really playing many defensive cards. It was just playing 1 copy of Iono and 2 copies of Path. But I think we could easily be going down that direction again, where we see, you know, the Ionos and the Roxans alongside possibly 2 or 3 Paths in the deck list. And that's just going to naturally be a headache for Charizard to deal with, which I think is pretty handy for you. And I also think that this deck, you know, with Gates, could easily just splash in a Grass-style attacker. I remember way back when the Tina deck first actually came out, I was thinking of Leafeon as a 1/1 in my Tina. You can look back at those videos if you really want to. It's not a terrible idea. And if we are seeing more multi-prizes, actually having a turn attachment onto a Tina and a Leafeon to end your turn isn't the worst idea. It means you don't need to turbo to that 7. And it means that you can just turn attach and swing on turn 2 quite reliably with a V-Star. So I think that's also a really interesting approach. So yeah, I think there could easily be a way for, you know, the sort of Wo-Cheni X's, the Shaman V's, the Leafeon V and V-Star package to actually start coming into Giratina and being a reasonable asset, just because of how important I think it is to have a little bit of grass type coverage if you're not content with just Path being a little helping hand against Charizard. Onto ARCTINA then. Just like with Umbreon, I think a 1-1 Leafeon V-Star is very powerful in this archetype. It helps you get that turn 1 energy drop on your Arc, which is never a bad thing, and it chips in at dealing with a Charizard in a one-hit KO fashion. The deck already has Judge Path, so you have a pretty solid win con there whenever you go first as ARCTINA into Charizard, but also having that Leafeon option just makes you a little bit more robust and gives you that push-through potential to deal with at least one of their Charizards, and then hopefully you can be looking towards getting through their Pidgeot and getting through their Arc throughout the remainder of the game. Once again, Vengeful Punch, pretty nice upgrade to the Box of Disaster, which I was playing for a decent amount of time in ARCTINA in the previous format. The biggest upsides is that it helps so much against so many things, and if there are archetypes that are doing prep damage, you're no longer blocked by... or the Box of Disaster is no longer blocked, which is really important, right? This is just a more universal tool. And I'm a big believer of Vengeful Punch. I think Guardy's still going to be a big archetype, and I do think there's more reason for CHIEN-PAO to see a lot of play. So I think this is going to be a big tool for the ARCEUS decks, no doubt. Onto Rapid Box. Couple, again, sort of side upgradey type things where the deck already was quite happy to play as many as like 3 Forest Seal Stone. Now you can just cut one, add a Stadium. Suddenly it's an additional Path Bounce for a variability reliant deck with your Double Gunners and your Alakazam. And it gives you that Tutor for Forest, which is never a bad thing. And Letter of Encouragement, we're a deck that does play Irida, so having a means of thinning the deck of water energy is pretty nice. Typically you're just relying on energy retrievals, but actually having deck thinning on your side is pretty reasonable. So yeah, I think it's okay. I think the archetype doesn't really fear any of the new decks in format either, and has means of getting early knockouts on, you know, little Pidgeys and Charmanders and whatnot, because they're all 60 hit point basics. So yeah, I think there's reason to still think Rapid Box will be a contender in the format for sure. Onto MIRAIDON FLAAFFY, similar things here really, where the Town Store could turn this deck into a bit of a package where we have EXP Share, Bravery Charm, Punch, Choice Belt, Forest Seal Stone, all these options, but they're cards you don't really want to play high counts of because they just ruin your consistency. But if the Town Store is kind of stitching this all together and helping you pick these cards when they're powerful, it could end up being a thing. Now, the one thing I should say about this archetype is that it did fairly well at the World Championships, and the best way that it was played was with a sort of Path Judge, Path Iono combination. And as I was just saying with ARCTINA, we know that Path Judge is very powerful, right? And it's going to be powerful against Charizard builds as well, where this deck may possibly lack some damage outputs. You're hoping that you can buy a turn here or there with that hand disruption. And I do think that could continue to be a pretty powerful option in the format. Quick note on the new MIRAIDON EX, it could end up being a one-of. It's a natural free retreater, which the deck is often looking for, just so you can have something to retreat into when you're looking to use your generators on other attackers. But also its 2 attacks aren't too bad. You get a refund on one of your energies. If you attach 3 and go for a Techno Turbo, you can get an energy attachment from the discard pile immediately onto one of your bench Pokemon. So you're just starting to power up multiple threats throughout the game, which is never a bad thing. This is a really reasonable card at getting through single prize Pokemon, because its damage output does the job quite contently without those same downsides of, for example, your other Miraidons and whatnot. So could end up sneaking into the deck list. Finally, we have PALKIA CHIEN-PAO. Again, like I was saying with Miraidon, lacking that damage output is a bit of a concern for Charizard as a new archetype on the block, as long as your Greninja doesn't really like wipe the board in the opening stages. If the opponent does develop their Manaphy and whatnot, you're going to have a hard time in that one, I think. But I do think there could once again be a chance for the Lunar Rock package to end up seeing some play here and making Palkia a new disruptive Path-based archetype. We know, again, this deck otherwise would really fear Path. Now you don't have to fear Path because you have Lunar Rock yourself, and you could be the one pathing other people. I think it's a really interesting dynamic here, where there could be some lower maintenance archetypes like this one that doesn't require too many bench spaces and can play this Lunar Rock package, and then suddenly you're a Path deck. And it's like playing ARCTINA, where you have that heavy disruption element within the deck list, but you're playing Palkia and CHIEN-PAO, which has higher upside just for higher damage output and more flexibility with your Greninja attacking presence as well. So yeah, I think it's a potential new dynamic for Palkia CHIEN-PAO. Again, similar to the Gardevoir, I think it's fairly untested. This deck isn't the lowest maintenance because you oftentimes want to have Big Barrel as well as Greninja on the board somewhere, so it may be too costly for your bench space at the end of the day. But I did want to just touch on this because I do think that Path is just getting stronger and stronger. It seems to be one of the best answers to so many decks in format right now, that if you don't get disrupted by opponents' paths because you're playing Lunarok, but then against other archetypes which are ability reliant, you're disrupting them, I think it's just a really powerful combination in the format. So Palkia, as we know, very efficient, very solid attacker. The CHIEN-PAO offers one-hit KO potential maybe once or twice a game, and the Greninja offers some spread potential that forces respect, right? It forces people to put Manaphy down in the opening stages, which isn't always easy for you, so, or easy for the opponent, because they just may not have a good enough hand to do that in the first place. So this deck is very consistent, and turning your Lost City disruption into Lunar Rock Path disruption could be really interesting as well. Let me know your thoughts on the Space Rocks down below. Am I just in complete cuckoo land thinking that there could be archetypes in the format that could afford to give up 2 bench spaces? Because that's the biggest challenge, I think, for this sort of approach. But I think there could be big payoffs for this sort of card because I'm just a big Path believer in general. Let me know your thoughts down below. How big of an impact is Charizard going to make? Have I been overestimating it this whole time with this whole wave of grass Pokemon going into different archetypes, this, that, and the other? How big of an impact will Vengeful Punch see in the format? It's something that I'm a massive fan of, but haven't seen many other people talking about this, I guess. And yeah, anything else you want to discuss down below? If there was any other archetypes that you want to discuss in terms of their impact and how they'll be adapting next set. Have you got any ideas around Sizzle? I'll hear it all down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.